machine.
When you have mercy or compassion or forgiveness, there's a wrong. Like you said, there's a wrong that needs to be forgiven. Do you think that there's this lack of study of mercy, forgiveness, and compassion? Is there any connection with that and the lack of an understanding of sin or evil that is kind of built into us, and not just some people that do evil things?
Right.
But
Yeah.
like it's something that's part of us.
That's a really interesting question, because the other thing that I've been studying a lot, I had a student do her dissertation on when addiction became conceptualized as a medical disease. You know, when did that concept emerge? And she was able to trace it back to a French physician in mid-19th century France, like publishing this idea around 1847. And this is, I promise this is going to get back to your question. But what she found was that not mercy, but the idea, this idea of sin was still part of this idea of addiction as a disease at that time. There was a whole movement in medicine to try to secularize what had been traditionally more church directed discussions, or more religious discussions about how moral issues can impact mental health and well-being. So there was that was still very much there. In fact, in Morrill, who was the physician that she was studying, was himself a Catholic. He was a fairly radical left sort of Catholic who was tied to a kind of Catholic socialism at that time, but still a Catholic, and saw that really what he saw as conditions of social injustice, like poverty at that time, were contributing to conditions that lent themselves to addiction. And I think in many cases he was right. I mean, in that many conditions of poverty, conditions of in this case, there's a lot of post-traumatic stress, because literally every 2 years there's some kind of revolution happening in France at this time, and people being killed, and within people's lifetimes you had the terror. So I think Morrill was aware that there was a kind of what he called a degeneration of the culture, and that was impacting people mentally. But a lot of this was also about perpetuation of kinds of sin that was corrupting families and the culture, and that people were suffering from that. But he thought that became physical, right? That it had physical manifestations, that it caused degeneration in the brain and the nervous system, that could actually be passed along genetically and culturally to the next generation, and that you had a degeneration of the person and the family over time. But within a generation, within about, let's say that was 1847, by the 1880s, there's a shift in the discourse towards understanding addiction primarily as a biological problem. Okay. And that required biological solutions. So you get a loss of this idea of sort of sin or morality contributing to psychological problems.
Yeah. Well, it seems that looking at a lot of the shifts in that era towards more of a secular understanding of psychology, as well as a lot of areas of life, that people looked back at the church and at scripture and said, there are all these things that are looked at as spiritual issues.
Right.
And yet we know that there's a physical or a psychological component to it. Therefore, the spiritual side must just be something that they made up to explain it, and it's just physical or psychological.
Right. I think so. Right. Yeah. So in certain aspects of the culture, mid 1800s, people are still accepting that there's a spiritual component, but that the spiritual component has a psychological and a physical component. They don't see those as incompatible. By the 1880s, you see there was an anti-clerical sort of sentiment that was growing in French medical community over the course of that century, but really becomes empowered in the 1880s because of shifts in government that were happening in France at that time. And so the anti-clerics sort of came into power, and the church lost a lot of its power and authority in the culture. And one of the first things they did is went in and got rid of all the clergy in the hospitals, including, the nuns that were working in the hospitals, and replaced them with sort of secular nurses and doctors and so on. So, and a big part of that, a big part of the rhetoric around that was that there were all these sort of backward ideas, going on in medicine, like that mental illness is really a biological problem, and that for a long time people thought that this had to do with sort of demons, and exorcism was the way to treat it. It was a very kind of unfair, anachronistic kind of way of sort of reading those ideas. There's this really interesting tension even at that time among some of the French physicians, because they don't all agree on that. Like Pierre Genet, for example, he really saw something to the church's understanding of possession and thought it had some meaning. He tried to understand it through hypnosis and the concepts of the unconscious, but he took it pretty seriously. And when he worked with a woman, for example, who was a mystic, who was in the hospital, he was very respectful of her religious beliefs. He felt that it was actually beneficial to her well-being to affirm her spirituality, even though he didn't agree with them or accept them. He thought that there was something to it that was worthy of respect. But then you had other physicians like Charcot, for example, who were overtly hostile to bringing any spiritual discussion. He thought it was regressive, and it would take us back to sort of a pre-scientific or anti-scientific sentimentality that medicine had to get rid of if it was going to progress.
Thank you for watching this Nerding Out short. Click here to watch the full episode. Click the subscribe button and the bell notification to know when we put up new videos. To support the channel, head over to Nerdy Catholic Tees and purchase some nerdy merch of your very own.
System shut down.